Hello and welcome to the podcast. Aside from the tragic physical conflict that is consuming the Middle East, there is a propaganda war going on. Here in the UK, one of the most effective proponents of the Israeli position is the blandly titled UK Media Research Centre. Its chair is the former BBC Director of Television, Danny Cohen, who sits on its board alongside Lord Ian Austin and Karen Pollock, CEO of the Holocaust Education Trust. It seems to have a hotline to the Daily Telegraph in particular, where Danny Cohen is frequently given prime position to comment and has called the BBC institutionally anti-Semitic. This week, another blandly titled organisation waded into the fray. This is the Centre for Media Monitoring, and I went to the launch of its latest report in Parliament on Tuesday evening. One of its key aims is to, and I quote, ensure that what is reported on Islam and Muslims in the media is fair, accurate and responsible. Its latest report is titled BBC on Gaza-Israel. One story, double standards. There's no question mark. And it claims that Palestinian lives simply do not matter equally in an asymmetric conflict. It covers the period October 2023 to October 2024, and it says that its findings beg the question, does the BBC find Palestinian suffering less newsworthy than Israeli suffering? Or is Israeli violence less shocking and newsworthy than Palestinian violence? I'm now joined by Miqdaad Versi, Director of Media Monitoring at the Muslim Council of Britain. Miqdaad Versi, welcome to the podcast. First of all, what is the Centre for Media Monitoring, and why did you have set it up?
Well, we're an organisation which is aiming quite simply to improve the reporting of Islam and Muslims in the UK mainstream media. What we realised through a lot of discussion through time was that the way the media was reporting about Islam and Muslims was problematic. And what I started with was highlighting examples where there were just pure inaccuracies. I found example after example. I raised it to the press regulator in the press, IPSO, and slowly they started changing them. And literally over 100 examples in the first couple of years were just changes that were being made, demonstrating the scale of the issue and the fact that people were just lying about Islam and Muslims because they thought they could get away with it. And so what we thought was that the media needed to be monitored and held accountable for inaccuracies and lies. And what we then understood is that it's more than just inaccuracy. It's actually more obviously about the narrative. It's about the overall shaping. And that's where we've now developed our capabilities to start analysing that more effectively, which is what we've done in this report, which we're going to talk about today.
Well, it's an extremely extensive report. It's over 170 pages. It's very well produced. And the BBC has not yet, shall we say, addressed some of those concerns in detail. Though at the meeting I attended on Tuesday night in the House of Commons, Richard Burgess, who is, I think, number 2 or number 3 in BBC News, did go there and listened and protested. Well, he protested essentially the fact the BBC wasn't consciously biased, that it wasn't prejudiced, but he didn't really engage, as far as I was concerned anyway, with a lot of the detail of your report. But just before we go into that, to ask you about the methodology, because the BBC has said it has reservations about part of your methodology, which was to use AI. Now, why did you choose to use AI, and do you think there are concerns about its use?
There are always concerns about usage of different technologies and how you use it, but what we wanted to do was be careful and thoughtful about it. The reason we used AI was because the scale of number of articles and clips was so large that over the period that we were looking at, which is a whole year, there were 43,000 different pieces of content across both Gaza, Israel, and Ukraine, Russia, which we wanted to compare it to. And so no team in a short period of time could analyze all of those in a consistent way, like a machine can do, across language, tone, coverage. Like it's very difficult to do, and you can't easily detect the patterns we want to do. So what we thought was, how can we use AI as a tool to allow us to go beyond anecdotes to evidence? Because what some people do, and I find this really problematic, is they find one example and they say, oh, look, this is what's happening. And that's not helpful because...
No, they tend to say, you go and find out what you want to find out. And it may not be representative, but if it's enough to make an article or a case, you're there. So I think the AI gives you, as it were, a sense of the terrain. But other people would say one of the problems it does not give you is the context. In other words, if you say X is mentioned 1,000 times, it will have been mentioned 1,000 times, and AI will be right. It doesn't necessarily tell you how it is used.
I think that's a fantastic point, and that's exactly what we wanted to engage with. What we want to do is have a mixture of different things. So you can't dismiss this just in an individual way. So what do I mean by that? If you are counting numbers and saying, this is the number of times something is mentioned, what we wanted to do is say, if you look across a whole year, a lot of those contextual factors balance each other out, number one. But where it doesn't, we actually are a bit more careful, right? So there are certain things that you will often see in articles. So for example, at the bottom of an article, you often will see Israel, there are 1,000 odd people who were killed on October the 7th. And that's sort of the final paragraph of an article, which might give the impression that those casualties are always mentioned in every single article. And that, that's not fully fair to just use that as a means to say that Israel's, being double counted and suddenly is being more prominent than Palestinian deaths. So what we also did was look at headlines alone. What we also did was look at the first paragraph alone. So when we identify issues with the approach we're taking, we then try to adapt it to ensure that we can actually get the point that we're trying to make. So we didn't use AI in a blind way. We did it in a very thoughtful way because what we genuinely care about, and I don't know how people realize this. Like I passionately believe in the BBC. Like I look at America, I look at other places in the world where we don't have a national broadcaster which can act in this way, and I worry. I get scared. Why? Because if I look at the way that Muslims are looked at in Fox News and in America, I don't want that to be the case. And when I see GB News here, we did a report on this, it's hugely problematic.
On GB News, yes, an earlier report, yeah.
And so from our perspective, I passionately believe that BBC has not just the potential to be amazing, but it is fundamentally a public good. It's something that I want to be good. And that's why I want to engage positively and constructively. I'm not here to just attack the BBC. I'm here to constructively improve. And that's why we've engaged with the BBC privately and publicly in the past. And we will continue to do so in the future because we want that to happen. So the purpose is positive engagement for a constructive, better approach at the end.
Well, you've got, to a degree, a positive engagement from the BBC because Richard Burgess, mentioned, I think, was there at the meeting on Tuesday night and so on. Though you haven't had a response in detail to your report, and I'm not sure if the BBC is going to take one. I mean, essentially what the BBC said was, we absolutely reject ideas that we are consciously biased, and our journalists try desperately hard to represent everything. So don't charge us with being consciously biased. Secondly, that we want to listen. Everybody should have access to us, and we want to engage. But actually did not engage in detail with your report. Now, let's assume they give them time, and let's assume that there is another side. But your report is, for a journalist like myself, looking at pretty remarkable, shall I say. I mean, there are a whole range of key statistics you put forward. You say that the BBC gave Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage across articles when measured on a fatality basis. What did you mean by that, the fatality basis?
So what I mean is that given the fact that 34 times more Palestinians had been killed in that period than Israelis were killed, the coverage should reflect that. That's our fundamental premise. Our fundamental assumption or question is we should treat all lives equally and you should report on all lives equally. Palestinian lives should not be given more or less prominence. You should, if there's one, you should treat them equally. That was our fundamental question. And what we found was that wasn't the case. And actually, when you delve into this, the proportionality was problematic in the sense that you had a similar number of articles across both. And that for us is a problem, because there were 34 times more on one side than the deaths on one side than the other. So you'd assume that there would be some level. And we're not saying, by the way, it's important to note here, we're not saying that there necessarily has to be one-to-one parity, because I appreciate you're not going to have 34 times more articles about Palestinians. Like that's difficult. We're not asking for that. But what we are saying is that scale of difference is quite extraordinary.
But you've also said, and I should just underline that this was a report carried out over a year, and the year ended October, I think, of 2024. But it's not just the fact about so many more Palestinians have been killed, which is a fact, and you don't think that's properly reflected. You say that the BBC interviewed significantly fewer Palestinians than Israelis, and the figures you gave were 1,085 Palestinians and 2,350 Israelis. You say also the BBC gave Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage across articles when measured on that fatality basis, and so on. You've also got unhappiness about the terms used, genocide and others. The BBC uses emotive terms, atrocities, slaughter, barbaric, deadly, brutal, and others almost 4 times as much when describing Israeli victims, and so on. There are a vast number of concerns that you express there. And the key question, I suppose, here is, if it's not intentional, if you accept that on the whole the BBC is likely to be mistaken rather than, as it were, conspiratorial, then you've got to think, we've got to analyse why that should be. Now, a number of people might put up arguments like this. Well, first of all, Palestine doesn't have a government. I mean, you compare, the way in which Ukrainian government, or Ukraine, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine situation, Ukraine gets much more sympathetic treatment by the BBC. But one of the things, of course, is Ukraine has a government. It has a very a brilliant president who does public relations superbly. And the problem with the Palestinians is that their leadership in the West Bank is Hamas, which many consider a terrorist organization, but is not recognized internationally. In terms of the West Bank, and so it's the PLO, which many people regard as particularly corrupt. But actually, when it comes to a single spokesman for the Palestinians who's articulate, who speaks English very well, who can make the case, there does not appear to be one. And isn't this a fundamental issue?
I think that there is some truth to elements of that. But I think that there are specific spokespeople who speak very well, right? The Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hussam Zomlot, he was at the event that you attended.
Yes, and was very articulate, yes.
And he's on the news quite a lot. He's very articulate. He's very clear. He's a person who's always available when required, and has been on BBC several times, and does a very good job in sharing and showcasing the Palestinian perspective. There's not a lack of Palestinian spokespeople. That might have been the case in previous conflicts between Israel and Gaza. That's not the case anymore. There are a significant number of Palestinian spokespeople who can be excellent in sharing what they would consider to be the truth. So I think nowadays, I don't think that argument holds. And I think there's a bigger fundamental question.
Well, there's another argument, if I may say. The other argument is the obvious one, which is that independent journalists can't get into Gaza.
Correct.
And that therefore anything that comes out of Gaza is questioned, particularly about those who are pro-Israeli, and everybody is assumed, or they say everybody can only speak if Hamas agrees, and therefore, etc., etc. So, granted the difficulty the BBC has there, which is that it cannot report fully from one side, but can report pretty fully from the other, what do you think it should do?
And this is a really good question. From my perspective, actually, the BBC's role is to inform the audience. It can't just say, I can't get one side, so I'm only tell one side of the story. That's neither due impartiality, nor fair, nor informative. That's unfair and biased, right? So I don't think that's the answer. The answer is you have to find an alternative. So, for example, there's lots of United Nations lots of United Nations and World Food Programme and doctors on the ground who have both been there, seen it directly. If you don't trust the Palestinians on the ground, which I think is problematic, but if you don't trust the Palestinian journalists, which I think is problematic, if you don't trust the people who are there and videoing and being there, okay, well then do you trust Western individuals who've been there on aid programs, or you don't trust them either. Like, there's multiple levels of ability for you to verify certain things, right? When it comes to death figures, I think this is an example which is really powerful, right? Almost nobody really questions the fact that tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed. Like, nobody really questions that. The only thing is, do you want to belittle it? Do you want to try and show some shade over it? No one really thinks that less than tens of thousands have been killed. Nobody really thinks that. Israelis, Palestinians, no one does. But still, whether it's 50,000 or 52,000, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not the issue. The issue is tens of thousands have been killed. And those are figures that everyone agrees on. So why do you have to try and always diminish them? Like, that's the type of thing I think is problematic.
Well, can I just on that point, I do read sometimes Haaretz, which is a leftish newspaper in Israel, and it has reports a number of IDF and other officers who don't seriously question the numbers. But even if you halve them, in terms of Palestinian deaths, you'd still be left with something like 25-1. So I agree with you, but of course, the BBC has got itself into a position, or had to be in a position, where it has to use this phrase according to the Hamas health industry or whatever, and can't get past this way of using figures, which can, I think, create an impression that they're not entirely reliable. Whereas, paradoxically, if you talk to a whole range of people in Israel, they would tell you actually they are accurate, etc., etc. I wonder, though, whether that one of the problems here is that news is a bit like a machine. And that maybe asking too much of news and maybe not enough of current affairs. That is to say, news reacts to an event. It automatically says, where are the pictures? If it's in television, who's got the pictures now, by the way, not in 24 hours' time. Oh, we have one side, we have the other, and off we go. And by the way, there's another important story just happened on the other side of the world, so we can't spend a lot of time. So news is locked into that sort of thing. So what is crucial, but I would say this is no current affairs hand, of course, is the current affairs programs, the context. So from my point of view, this is supposed to be an interview with you, not me telling you this, but from my point of view, no proper history of the Middle East has been done. No context, no real examination of what Zionism means, no context, no explanation of a whole range of things, or actually of Hamas. And, Hamas is an organization committed in its founding document to the elimination of the State of Israel. But I can't remember a program about Hamas and on the BBC and so on. I haven't seen, although there have been one or two programs, but nothing in detail about what's going on in the West Bank and so on. So I wonder whether you, in a sense, asking too much of news and too little of the contextual programming that a public service broadcaster ought to provide.
I think I agree with some elements. That's why I think that you're right, that news have limitations, that we should not try and, we have to be careful about expecting too much there. But I think that the minimum I'm expecting is not actually that high or that different. And the BBC actually is really good at this sometimes. I think in our report, we highlight really good practice as well in cases. So it's not that it can't do it or that news isn't able to do it, is it doesn't systematically do it. And I think that's our problem. Let's say, for example, we chatted a little bit earlier, just now, about how Gaza is run by Hamas, and that's a problem. And you mentioned how the West Bank is run by the PLO, which is corrupt by many. I mean, Israel's run by Netanyahu, who is currently indicted by the International Criminal Court. I mean, there's probably not a bigger way to be indicted or attacked. Like, that context is not a difficult context.
Yes, although I should say that's absolutely right, but there are plenty of Israelis. Israel is still a democracy, and there are plenty of Israelis, including former heads of the Shin Bet and the armed forces and others, who call out Netanyahu, who disagree with his policy, who call him corrupt, and who have, and indeed called out the racism of two members of his government, Mr. Ben-Gvir and Mr. Smotrich, who are, by any definition of racist, have been found by Israeli courts to be racist, and indeed at one stage were banned, I think, by the Board of Deputies over here from coming to speak. Of course, all this gets a bit lost in warfare and so on. But that is a difference, at least.
But I was saying Netanyahu as the prime minister, though, right? I think my point is, though, Netanyahu is the prime minister. He's the head of the government, and he's indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Like, this is the highest level of court in the world who has indicted him. And it's an international criminal court. Like, if you wanted to think from a BBC perspective, if it's difficult to talk about the Israeli perspective and the Palestinian perspective, then what do you need to do? You need to find third-party arbiters who are respected globally at United Nations, human rights groups. But the problem is those groups are not treated as independent arbiters. They're treated as pro-Palestinian almost, right? And it's trying to give balance to an Israeli perspective. That's not the case. These are independent, which will help you see the light from the trees, right? What's actually happening. And the problem you have is that the lack of context we're talking about Netanyahu being, for example, indicted by the ICC, being a regular thing that's talked about, is only one part of the story. There's so many big elements. In our report, we highlight example of genocidal statements that have been made by Israeli leadership. Now, genocidal statements matter because if the Israeli leadership is making these genocidal statements and then engaging in war crimes or indicted by the ICC, and then we see on the ground all of these examples where women and children are being burnt alive. Like, you see this. You have to put the story together. That's the story. The story is...
Well, of course, the BBC would say we've done that. Anybody listening to Jeremy Bowen, who has a lot of responsibility, a massive responsibility on his shoulders, would say that these things have been pointed out. They've pointed out that if you put a missile at a tower block, you may kill the person you want to kill, but you're going to kill a whole range of other people, who include mothers, children's, and so on, a whole range of those things. And there have pictures of that. Of course, what they haven't got on the whole is the correspondence on the ground. But these things are mentioned.
But they're mentioned, I think it's really important here. There's a difference between it being mentioned as a side point and as the driver of the strategy, and in particular, the deliberate killing of civilians, right? There's lots of examples of deliberate killing of civilians, whether that's aid agencies coming out, World Food Kitchen on the top and being attacked, ambulances being attacked, journalists being targeted and killed. Like, these aren't individual cases which are almost on the side. This is the doctrine. And the 2 or 3 points I think are worth noting here. Firstly, the BBC has chosen not to mention many of the genocidal statements in any news article on its website. Like on Amalek, for example.
Well, you see, I find that, look, I'm sorry, I must interrupt. I find this... knowing the BBC I do and news people I do and from the inside or whatever, and they have made lots of mistakes and I disagree with a lot of it, I do not think they would choose not to. The point is, do they choose to? Do they choose? Yes, I know, and that's one of the difficulties I think where with one or two people here listed last night is that it's too easy to try and say it's an individual problem, a mistake, or bias. Although it's understandable that people are passionately involved should feel that, and of course the number of Jewish producers and others on the BBC are deeply unhappy with the BBC, in that way, and are worried in the opposite direction. It's really, if one starts to, go for motives and so on, it's rather difficult. But if you go for facts, as your report has a number of extraordinarily disturbing facts. That's quite fascinating. But also what's interesting is the use of language. Sorry, is another crucial thing you talk about. As Richard Burgess said last night, the BBC has had to go through a very tough time explaining why it doesn't say about Hamas as a terrorist organization. I mean, the front page of the Daily Telegraph almost daily castigated for doing that. At the same time, you criticized the BBC for not using a number of terms like genocide. Now, the problem about that is that genocide is an intention. It's as I understand it, the policy, an intention to wipe out a community. And it's one thing to say that Israeli armed forces pay little or no attention to the civilian casualties involved. Another to make the judgment that the purpose is to eliminate effectively people. So the BBC has tended to not say that, but to report as fully as it can numbers involved and what's happening and the fact that civilians are being killed.
I agree.
Why are you so concerned that it should use terms like genocide?
I'm actually not necessarily expecting the BBC in its voice to use the term genocide. I don't think that's something that we're calling for. What we're saying is it shouldn't shut it down when interviewees talk about it. We're saying that they should give due prominence and due explanation as to why people are doing it. So the problem... Well,
you've got a headline in your book which said, a headline in your report which said the BBC suppresses or minimises allegations of genocide.
We're not talking about the BBC's voice here. We're talking about when interviewees come on, when that interviewee says, there's a genocide taking place. The reason is many elements of the United Nations have called it. Many human rights organizations have called it. This is why we're calling it as such. It is reasonable in that circumstance to not just minimize and say, no, but Israel says the opposite. It's about saying, well, okay, you're talking about human rights groups are saying this. Okay, let's explore this. The problem is that...
No, sure, the problem is the policy. The problem is if the BBC commits itself to reporting, it reports what it can establish. It can report what other people say. But if they make a judgment, there is a policy at the heart of the Israeli government of genocide. That's a different matter. And if it can't prove that, it shouldn't use it.
I don't think, and as I said, we don't think the BBC should be, in its voice, as a presenter, should not be saying, Israel, this is a genocide. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is if an interviewee comes and says it, it's not for the BBC to consistently say, no, that's the opposite. We need to shut you down, talk about something else. That's not what it should do. I mean, one example, I think it was on the BBC Newsnight, if I'm not mistaken, in the case we've cited in the report, they said, oh, but genocide is not what's happening here. Like that is an example of something that the BBC should not say. What we need is a more objective statement where the BBC doesn't have to make a call on it, but it should at least lay out the evidence. It should at least be able to say, look, these are the genocidal statements that these people have made. You can make a call. This is what's happening on the output. These are the human rights organizations who've said this. We're not making a call. We're reporting what's out there. Israel has said no, and this is the rationale. Fine. But that's like, it needs to be explained. And the point is that things like the Amalek phrase that Netanyahu talked about, basically destroying the Palestinians, that sort of genocidal statement.
Well, hold on a second. I looked that up, and I think in Jewish history, Amalek is used as a representative of an evil force determined to destroy the state of Israel.
Correct.
And then, of course, there are other interpretations, which I'm afraid a lot of us would not understand, but those deeply involved in the conflict would. And there's still some debate about that. But I mean, I think
I think they themselves would agree. Like, this is not a massively complex situation. There's lots and lots of these types of phrases or genocidal statements that have been used by Israeli leaders. Again, you don't have to make a call on it, but showcasing it, like these genocidal statements at some point in a whole year of a conflict on the BBC website is not an unreasonable expectation. You know, they're big things like the Hannibal Directive, the Dahiya Doctrine. These are big policy items that have been omitted entirely from the coverage. And the problem is, as I'm trying to get across, is...
Well, again, I think the problem is that, you know, this is exactly the sort of stuff that you would want and expect Panorama to get after. And a number of things. John Ware came on our program, John Ware, who has connections with the Jewish community through his children and so on, and still was quite critical of the BBC about not doing sufficient about what's happening to Palestinians, for example, in the West Bank. But again, he was saying that actually what's missing here is that often asking those deeper questions. You can't ask news to do everything. And at a time when you're dealing with Trump doing heaven knows what, and you're dealing with issues in this country, the news's time is always going to be limited. And therefore, it's the context provided. Can I just ask you, we're coming to the end of our time, and I apologize for interrupting you so much. This report covered the period up to October 2024. Have you any evidence that since then, in the 9 months, almost 6 to 9 months, things have changed at all?
I would say in the last 2 or 3 months, anecdotally, rather than in an evidence-based way, so I want to be slightly careful about how I draw conclusions, there have been more careful and thoughtful challenge to some of the Israeli claims, especially when it comes to ethnic cleansing and starvation. I think that the evidence was so overwhelming that it has become impossible to just say, no one's dying. When an Israeli individual comes on and says, there's no starvation, we're giving lots of food, now there's challenge to that. And there's been more of that. I think that's a good sign. I think there have been a couple more really good articles which have given greater context, like the war crimes article that Jeremy Bowen did a couple of weeks ago. Like, those types of things are helpful. And my point on things like Dahiya Doctrine or Hannibal Directive and Amalek, I'm not saying these should be part and parcel of all news coverage. I'm saying that across a whole year period, the biggest drivers of demonstrating intent for the killing of Palestinians have not been showcased or discussed at all. at any coverage.
No, and I'm just saying to you that I think it's unrealistic to expect news to do that. It's not unrealistic. Instead, for current affairs programs and contextual programs to seize those things. We're coming to the end of our conversation, I'm afraid, but obviously the elephant in the room is the fact that the opposition, if you like, we can say to you, that I mentioned, is extremely effective. It's well funded. It works closely with the Israeli government. It has, and this is not to believe there's sort of conspiracies going on, because they're open about it. There are a significant number of Jews and others in this country who are passionate about the survival of Israel, who do genuinely believe it's under threat, and who make that case very powerfully and effectively. And also they have very sympathetic organisations like the Daily Telegraph, for example, who allow Danny Cohen to write that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic and so on. You, by contrast, are a relatively small operation. But this report seems to me to be a very, pompous of me to say it, very important detail, requires the BBC to come back and deal with it in very great detail. And if it can't, as it were, disprove significant of the things you put forward, then there's a powerful case that it has to change in many ways what it's doing. But do you think that this... there is a change? There is a sea change, that you have enough support, or is it always going to be, to a degree, it's a poor example, you David against Goliath, which paradoxically you being David?
I think that we have really an uphill struggle here. We are a small organization. I think our communities have less influence in the positions and corridors of power. I think that our ability to shape the national conversation is much more limited. I think the willingness...
And is that because partly there's a reluctance so far, or in my experience, is a degree of reluctance from the Muslim community to really engage? Do you think that's changing? And, a recognition, as you clearly recognise, that you have to engage?
I think there's part of that, but I think there's, I think sometimes some of these narratives are understood when you know people in those spaces. And the number of Muslims in the upper echelons of decision-making roles within media organizations is less. Those who know Muslims in those organizations, in those positions, or Palestinians in those positions is less. And I think that, we have not done a brilliant job in showcasing that, but I think it's more than that. I think there's a structural challenge where we don't necessarily have that support. Even if you look at mainstream media coverage of this report, we've done in this report probably 1,000 examples, I'm making it 100 examples of individual things that are reported newsworthy. If one of those items was mentioned on the other way, we'd have a front page splash in right-wing press, and you'd have a letter going out from a senior MP, and there'd be the BBC Director General would be there, and there'd be Samir Shah from the BBC, from the chair, coming and talking about it. Whereas when we have 100 examples, we get close to no coverage. And that's even from sympathetic press. So I think that the challenge here is, why is that not happening? And I don't think that we can solve it all. What we can do is showcase the evidence, do what we can to hold the BBC and media outlets to account, and to try and encourage responsible reporting, and do so in a way that is effective and pragmatic.
Well, this report, as I said, if the clip or anybody's watching, it is there. But how can people access your report in detail? Because it needs to be looked at in detail. How can they access it?
They can go to our website, cfmm.org.uk. So that's the Centre for Media Monitoring. Or they can go on Instagram or on Twitter, or X, as it's now called, CFMM UK. And they will find all the details there, and lots and lots of Instagram-able posts and easy ways to read it if they find the whole report difficult.
Well, thank you very much. So we will ask Richard Burgess if he'll come on in 2 or 3 weeks' time and deal in detail with a lot of what you've said. I don't know whether to be optimistic or not, but thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Our thanks to Miqdaad Versi, Director of Media Monitoring at the Muslim Council of Britain. And you'll be able to find their full report, as he said, through their website. Now, we're going to be away for a couple of weeks, but we will be bringing you a podcast of an interview with the BBC executive that we think you'll be interested in. But in the meantime, if you're enjoying our journalism, please do support us for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page, or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. That's all for this week, and as you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a good egg production. Until next time, goodbye.